Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Dr. Jamie Koo. I'm an assistant professor at Lerner College of Medicine at Cleveland Clinic, a head and neck surgical oncologist, and the director of head and neck robotic surgery program at Cleveland Clinic. I'm pleased to moderate this webinar, Putting Patients First, Navigating Clinical Trials for Head and Neck Cancer. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Navigating head and neck cancer clinical trials can feel very overwhelming and complex. Our panel aims to demystify the process by offering a clear and comprehensive overview of what clinical trials are, how they function, and the key factors patients should consider when exploring participation. We will discuss the latest research developments, eligibility requirements, potential benefits and common concerns and misconceptions. Attendees will also learn practical strategies for finding appropriate clinical trials. Adding a personal perspective, a patient advocate and cancer survivor will share his journey, offering meaningful insights. The webinar will be recorded for those of you who may need to leave early. And we also provide a survey at the end of for you to provide feedback on our webinar. Just a reminder, we do welcome questions either by the live chat or through the Q&A box throughout the webinar. And we will have ample time at the end to answer questions by our three panelists. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce you to our Alliance Ambassador, Stephen Cassidy. Stephen Cassidy is a survivor of stage 4 oropharyngeal cancer. In the spring of 2016, at age 53, Stephen was diagnosed with stage 4 base of tongue cancer. 7 months after successfully completing his initial treatment, he began experiencing back pain. After a year after receiving a clear PET scan, he was diagnosed with metastatic cancer that has spread to his ribs, liver, and lungs. Stephen underwent another round of chemotherapy and radiation for the metastatic cancer, followed by participation in a 2-year immunotherapy clinical trial. Today, he remains stable with very few long-term side effects. Stephen currently lives in St. Petersburg, Florida, with his wife of 28 years. They have 2 adult sons who live locally, and he enjoys working with children, gardening, cycling, listening to music, traveling, and spending time with his dog. So Stephen will share us with his journey and experience with the life-changing clinical trial. And so thank you so much for being with us, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here with everyone, but literally and figuratively. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. You can go ahead to the next slide. So my cancer started roughly in 2016. It was base of tongue cancer. It turned out to be stage 4 once it was diagnosed. It took a really long time to diagnose, roughly 9 to 10 months. It was not HPV officially, although my oncologist thought it was. The biopsy just didn't show that. So, but it was. You see on the slide there, it was T2N2A, stage 4, base of tongue, P16 positive. And you can see the rest there. But again, not being HPV was interesting, and I wasn't a smoker or a dipper, so I wasn't really a candidate to get the cancer, but of course I did. You see on the left there, that's what tongue cancer, base of tongue cancer looks like. And on the right is just me getting my first radiation treatment. So next slide, please. My baseline treatment was at the VA. I'm a veteran, and my cancer metastasized roughly 5 months after I got my clear PET scan for the baseline treatment. I was out playing golf with my son, and I hit a drive, not a very good one, but I hit a drive and thought I pulled a muscle in my back. And again, that took physical therapists, massage therapists, chiropractors, etc. Another 9 or 10 months. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. Sent me back to my doctor. Eventually, she said, well, it's the same doctor I had for the original diagnosis. She said, what can we? There's nothing really wrong with you, Steve. What can we do to help you feel better? I said, well, another scan. So they did another CT scan, and as you see there, that's the PET scan shows I had a really large tumor. It was about 7 centimeters by 5 centimeters by 6 centimeters on my ribs. It ate three of my ribs, and there's a little small lesion on the bottom of my liver. Um, but so was back into baseline treatment, chemotherapy and radiation for the metastasis, which was stage 4 also. And I finished up the treatment at the VA and met with my oncologist. And basically, we established a plan for going forward, which was continue to monitor me. But then I said, what's next? And she said, well, basically, we wait to see what comes up next. And the she said there was an option to possibly go into some trials. So the VA participated with the local cancer hospital, Moffitt, here in where I live in actually in Tampa. So my oncologist at the VA got me in touch with the oncologist at the Moffitt, and I went over and interviewed with them for trials. And the doctor there had 3 trials that she would consider me for, but we discussed it and picked the one that she recommended. And so I went into a trial at Moffitt. It was a 1-year trial, phase 2, meaning there was about 50 people in the trial. Phase 2, meaning they were trying to determine I guess the term is efficacy. What the other doctors on the presentation will talk more to that, but they're trying to determine how well the treatment is. So it was a 1-year trial. I got treatment every 2 weeks on Monday for 1 year. It was about a 4-hour, 5-hour evolution and infusion at a separate unit at the cancer center for just trials. It was like a hospital within a hospital, which was kind of comforting. So I did well after 1 year, and they asked me if I'd like to stay with it, and I said sure. So I stayed in the trial for 2 years and finished the trial, and I was stable at the end. And I would like to point out the VA was very good to me, and the VA was very relational, where the trial was very transactional, very clinical. It was kind of different, and the VA provided the care via something called community care. If anybody out there is a veteran or knows someone who is a veteran, the VA cannot do trials because they can only do approved therapies, but they gave me access to the trial via community care, which basically means they picked up the tab, which was a great for me. It gave me a lot of comfort, and it released the financial burden of it. So next slide. So I already spoke about my baseline treatment and the metastasis. You can see that, and then the clinical trial. The trial introduced the drug nivolumab. I had already been receiving the cetuximab, the targeted therapy drug, in my metastasis treatment, but the trial really the thing that was unique about the trial was each drug individually, nivolumab and cetuximab, was approved for use and could be provided at the VA. But what they couldn't do is provide both drugs at the same time. So that's what it was. And my oncologist tried to suggest, like is trying to make 1 + 1 better than 2 by giving them at the same time. So next slide, please. So I'd like to speak a little bit more about my lessons learned, specifically in the context of the trial. And one thing I would say is advocate for yourself. Go out and look and find a trial. Don't wait for someone to find a trial for you. My doctors and oncologists were very helpful in that regard, but I was pretty aggressive about seeking out other options for care. I did intentionally stay with standard care. I didn't go for other types of non not other types of exploratory types of treatment. What I say there was trust. I'm going to go to the bottom there saying trust the doctor. I trusted the doctors. I believed in what they were telling me, and they had my best interest in mind. I didn't go looking for other ways that weren't approved or even what have you. So I would say trust the process. Um, a trial is a long process. As I said, I was in it for 1 or 2 and then 2 years. Uh, what was unique about the trial too was you never know during the trial what the how well the trial was doing. My oncologist could not and would not share with me how well the trial was doing with the other patients. She would just talk about how well I was doing, and I ended up doing very well. But also, I say trust the treatment. Uh, in that context, also, I say be patient. As I said, it was a long process, and progress is very slow. Nothing happens quickly in a trial. And if you're going through cancer, you wait and dread that next scan, or be it a CT or a PET scan, or possibly a biopsy. So you really just have to accept what you're doing and go through that. I One thing that was unique about being in a trial uh, versus being in baseline treatment. And baseline treatment, I thought they were helping me, and I was the patient. But in a trial, I was I took comfort in. I felt like I was also helping them, so it kind of gave me some purpose in that I was playing a role in helping possibly others, uh, which, as an aside, my older brother, ended up with uh, throat cancer about 2 years ago. And I think through my awareness, got he diagnosed very early, and it was only stage 1. So being in the trial, I felt like I was playing a role in the cancer curing process. Uh, I would say find support in friends and family. Uh, my wife and kids and friends were very helpful. Church was very helpful. I also accepted and went through counseling weekly at the VA. They provide mental health counseling, specifically with doctors that only treat cancer patients, and that was extremely helpful to me in coping with the cancer journey and the trial journey. Um, the I also found support in doing exercise, and specifically Tai Chi. At my doctor's recommendation, I started doing Tai Chi, and that was very helpful for me. So, from a purpose standpoint, uh, as I spoke of, you need to ideally find your purpose. And I spoke to how being in the trial kind of gave me some purpose. So possibly, if you participate in a trial, that could be your purpose too. I would encourage it. Find out, educate yourself, speak to your doctor, and just power ahead. And there's a light at the end of the tunnel. As I said, I'm happy to still be here. Statistically, I'm not supposed to be, so uh, it's great to be here. And I think the clinical trial was a big reason for that. So, next slide. There are 2 of my own quotes about this. These became tattoos of mine. The first one is, "This too shall pass." You know, you get through it. It'll be over. You're gonna ring the bell. And that was, "This too shall pass." Well, then when the metastasizing came back, which wasn't supposed to happen, I just, I chose the mantra, faith over fear. And faith can be whatever faith is to you. It doesn't have to be a specific religion or spiritual or whatever your faith is. Just, I'm a big one on the trust. So faith, trust the process, and don't let fear drive you in how you perceive cancer. And I guess my last lesson learned is, I really think attitude plays a big part in how your body reacts to the treatments, and and how well you cope with it. So anything that you can do to be more positive through the process can be very helpful. So that's all I have for us today. I will be on the whole presentation, and I can answer questions in the chat room. And if any questions come up at the end, I'd be very happy to answer anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. That was really, really helpful. I appreciate you sharing your story and giving us a personal insight into your journey and lessons learned with your experience with the clinical trial. So thank you. So our next presenter is our first expert panelist, Dr. Trisha Wise-Draper. So she's a professor of medicine in the Division of Hematology Oncology at the University of Cincinnati. She serves as the section head of medical oncology and co-leader of HEAL, or Head and Neck Experimental Advancement Laboratory, and the Head and Neck Disease Group at University of Cincinnati Cancer Center. Dr. Wise-Draper also leads the Head and Neck Oncology and Advanced Therapeutics, or Phase 1 Trials program. And additionally, she holds the role of Deputy Director of the Office of Clinical Research at UC. So Dr. Wise-Draper will start us off with an overview of clinical trials and who and why patients should consider being a part of one. So thank you, Dr. Wise-Draper.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for such a kind introduction. And thank you, Stephen, for giving us your story. It's very inspirational. A lot of our patients, I know, have a lot of questions about clinical trials, and being able to communicate with someone who's been through it is really important. So I'm going to go through just a few basics of clinical trials and hopefully answer some of those questions that a lot of our patients may have. These are my disclosures. So I first want to start with who should be considered for a clinical trial. And I would really say anytime there's going to be a treatment considered or a treatment changed, or even after treatment, it's important to consider a clinical trial. But more specifically, the first time you may be diagnosed with cancer, there may be trials available. The first time that you may unfortunately develop recurrent or metastatic disease, meaning the cancer has moved or come back in the same site, that is a good time to also consider a clinical trial, as well as if treatment's not working. So as I mentioned, anytime there's a change, you should be thinking about a clinical trial. And is there something else that I could be offered? Or is there only the therapies that we currently have available? The other time to consider clinical trials is if a patient's diagnosed with a rare tumor. Often we don't have good standard of care, therefore we don't always know what to do with those patients. So it's good to be considered for a clinical trial, as we may be able to give new hope. In addition, one of the questions I get a lot is, why should a patient enroll? Why should a patient ever consider to go onto a clinical trial? Well, clinical trial is oftentimes the only way you get access to novel drugs. Immunotherapy, for example, was novel at the time when it was first being developed and put into clinical trials in 2014. Nivolumab being one of the drugs that Stephen received, that was not approved several years ago. And so in order to get access to some of those stars, those novel drugs that are really going to change our field, clinical trials are often the only way to get into those or get access to these drugs. And standard therapies are often going to remain even after you do a clinical trial. In other words, if there's a standard therapy available, but there might be a better therapy that we don't know, but there might be a better therapy by going on a clinical trial, it's a good thing to consider going on that clinical trial, because if it unfortunately doesn't work, maybe you can still get that standard therapy later. And then I always bring up altruism. Stephen spoke to this a little bit. So altruism to me in clinical trials is some patients decide to go onto a clinical trial for the better good. That's not for everyone. Clinical trials aren't for everyone. But sometimes the thought is as well, hopefully it works for me. But even if it doesn't, maybe I can make a change and improve the care for others in the future. And so that's really another reason that I say, if you're passionate about that as I am, maybe that's a reason to go on a clinical trial. And finally, I kind of alluded to this earlier, clinical trials are the only process for approval for all patients. If we don't test the drugs first and show that they work, we're never going to be able to get FDA approval. So the most important question is, how do you find a clinical trial? If you're interested, what are the different ways that you can and try to identify something that will work for you? Clinicaltrials.gov is our main website that all of us have to list our trials on, whether an investigator sponsors them or one of our pharmaceutical companies. All trials are listed on clinicaltrials.gov. With that being said, they're not always very easily searchable, so sometimes you need a little help. Sometimes in in the clinics, especially in academic centers, but in other centers as well, there will often be clinical trial lists listed, or let us know if you're interested in research types of pamphlets. There will also be university and advocacy websites. So most universities will have a clinical trial website that is searchable. But importantly, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Head and Neck Cancer Alliance website, there are advocacy websites that you can also look up clinical trials, including the Cancer Research Institute, and then a lot of our big organizations, so ASCO, AHNS, etc. And then finally, ask your doctor, ask your oncologist who's taking care of you, because maybe they haven't considered it yet. But if you ask, then they can help you identify a clinical trial that might be right for you. So to explain a little bit, just using the HNCA Clinical Trial Finder, if you go to the website, you can go to the Clinical Trial Finder, and this is the Alliance Partners and allows a free clinical trial finder where it's designed for both patients, caregivers, as well as healthcare professionals that are looking for trials, specifically in head and neck cancer, that might match their stage of disease or the disease state they're in. So you go through here and you can start on this connect, and then you can go through the clinical trials. So the way it works, so there's a short questionnaire. It's going to be brief, but it's going to get a little bit of an idea of your history or your treatment history so that we are able to better match you to a clinical trial. So the system then will go to the current clinical trials that are available, and the results will show you where you might be preliminarily eligible. Now, it's not perfect, so you still have to review it with your physician and ask those questions, but it gives you a starting point, which is a great resource. So again, in the Clinical Trial Finder, it's using a lot of different resources itself. I mentioned clinicaltrials.gov. That is a comprehensive database. And so by using this Clinical Trial Finder, as you can see, here's the link, which was also put into the chat by Amanda. You can click on this link. It'll help you, and then you can use the resource to find these clinical trials. You can also call this number, and you can actually get a clinical trial navigator to help you as well. So this is a valuable tool, as I mentioned, for patients, for healthcare professionals, as well as caregivers, that'll help find potential trials for you that then you can go on to discuss with your doctor. So what are some common myths that are often conceived for clinical trials? I hear a lot, but these are some of the most common. So I often hear, well, I don't want placebo. I want to make sure I'm getting the real drug, or I don't want to get randomized. And so just to discuss that a little bit more, and I'll discuss it when I talk about the different phases of clinical trials, is when we're randomizing, we never give someone just placebo. The only time that would happen is, say someone has widely metastatic cancer and unfortunately is getting towards the last lines of treatment, and there are no other standard of cares left opportunities. In that situation, if the best supportive care is the standard, then that could be what you're randomized to, but that's what you would have gotten anyway. But normally, when we're randomizing, we're either randomizing you to the standard of care currently or to the new agent, maybe the new agent plus standard of care. But it would be unethical to not give you treatment for cancer if there is a treatment out there. So I think, that often scares patients. And I always say, worst case scenario is you get what I would have given you anyway. Best case scenario is we might get the new drug that you couldn't get without enrolling on a clinical trial. And so that's really important to understand is we would never want to offer a patient something as a physician that we don't think is going to help. The next thing to know is that we don't already know what the best treatment was. So again, if we're randomizing two different regimens, different treatments, we have to have what's called clinical equipoise. I would never open a clinical trial in my center if I thought I already knew that one was better than the other. A lot of times, if we're bringing novel drugs into the clinic, we are hoping that they're going to be better, but we don't know. Again, if we knew they'd already be approved, we wouldn't offer that trial. So it's important to know is that, and you can ask your physician, we should be honest with you. Do you have clinical equipoise? Do you really believe that, or do you really not know which treatment's best? We will be honest with you if you ask us. And then finally, I often hear, I don't want to be a guinea pig or experimented on. Well, we do a lot of rigorous testing prior to the drugs coming to the clinic. So both for safety as well as efficacy, so does it work in different models. And we wouldn't bring something to the clinic if we didn't have hope that it was going to work. We can never promise, we don't know, that's what the clinical trial is for, but we're hoping it's going to work for you. And we certainly, this is, as I mentioned, the only way that we can get drugs approved and become the new standard of care, which may be better, is to do these studies. But again, you have to be comfortable with it. So going very quickly through the different phases of clinical trials, there's 3 main phases. So phase 1 is going to be that first step. We're testing a new drug, or we're testing a old drug in a new way, like maybe with a different type of cancer. Here, it's really about safety. So can we find the maximum tolerated dose, which is defined as the dose that's the highest drug levels with the most acceptable toxicity profile. So we think it's going to benefit you, but it's not giving you side effects. We also do what's called PKs and PDs oftentimes in phase 1. And PKs or pharmacokinetics are how does the body affect the drug, like how do you clear it? And pharmacodynamics are how the drug affects the body, like what biomarkers change upon the response to the drug. But this is always the first step to get a new drug in. Who should be considered for phase 1? This is also a misnomer that I always want to make sure I clear up. Sometimes phase 1, especially all solid tumor, all comers, sometimes those are for patients who have no other options or nothing to lose, as I hear, but it's not always the case. Sometimes phase 1s are actually expansions of phase 1, so they're more like a phase 2, which I'll get to, but we already know the safety data, and so it's not really that new, and sometimes it's worthwhile considering that opportunity. It's also often the only phase that allows more than one line of treatment. And we also have to take in consideration, though, that not all drugs make it out of phase 1. As I mentioned, we like to try to bring all these new drugs into the clinic, but some of them fail. And in fact, only 1 out of 5 to 10 actually make it out of phase 1 and eventually go to phase 2. So it's really important that we put the right patients on the right trial and that you have that discussion with your physician to make sure it's the right fit for you. But I always say, what's the chance of the next line therapy working? So if you've already gone through a lot of standards of care and the next line of therapy is unfortunately 10% or less, it's probably time to consider a phase 1 option. Phase 2 studies are the next step. So once we get out of phase 1, we figure out it's safe, we think it's working, but we need to get a little bit more signal. Stephen brought this up, that he was on a phase 2 study. This is the next step, is does it work? Can we put more patients on? Do we have a good idea? Sometimes you can get FDA approval off of phase 2, but normally you need phase 3. But some of the more rare conditions or something that's working really well, we can sometimes get early approval just off of phase 2. There are often multiple types of phase 2. I won't go into the details, but single arm, multiple arm, and sometimes they can even be randomized on phase 2. And sometimes we can skip a phase 1 if we already know a lot about the drug, or maybe we're combining it with something, and we can do what's called a safety run-in. So we're not changing the doses, we're just making sure we treat a few patients first, make sure we don't have any unexpected toxicity or side effects, and then we can move on. This is usually about 100 patients or less, and often takes several months to a few years to complete. It really depends how many sites or like universities or different clinics are involved. And then finally is phase 3. So this is the larger studies. These are the ones that you normally need thousands of patients in order to achieve enough power statistically to say if something is really working or not. It's often compared to some kind of standard of care that's already approved, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it might be 2 standard of care options to try to determine which one's better, or if at least one's not worse, but maybe less side effects. Most of the time they're randomized, sometimes they're placebo controlled. And as I mentioned before, sometimes it can be compared to best supportive care if that is the standard of care for those patients. So that's all I have for you is some basics. Dr. Sacco will go into a little bit more detail on patient-oriented questions, but I'll leave you with this quote: research means that you don't know, but are willing to find out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wise-Draper. That was a great overview, especially touching on those common misconceptions. I think were very helpful and kind of reminding us what those 3 phases of clinical trials are. So just a reminder, I do see some questions coming in, but please drop your questions in our live chat and Q&A box. So our second expert panelist is Dr. Asuntina Sacco. She's a professor of medicine in the Division of Hematology Oncology at the University of California in San Diego, Morris Cancer Center. She's also the co-director of the Mark and Hannah Gleiberman Head and Neck Cancer Center. Dr. Sacco specializes in caring for patients with head and neck cancer, and her research primarily focuses on the development of clinical trials involving novel therapies. So today, Dr. Sacco will be addressing some of the most frequently thought of and asked questions by our patients and caregivers when considering or enrolling in a clinical trial. So thank you, Dr. Sacco.
Thank you, Dr. Koo. Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here with all of you and to follow these other fantastic speakers. Dr. Wise-Draper just did a really nice job doing a comprehensive overview of clinical trials. My presentation really will be more so focused on practical considerations. And what I mean by that are these are questions that I routinely encounter either by my patients directly or the clinical trial coordinators on our research team might receive those questions. And then also, sometimes people don't know what questions to ask. It's not uncommon that I will be asked, what question am I not asking that I should be? So I really wanted to raise a variety of points that you may already be thinking of or not sure to ask. And this is really geared for folks who are either actively interested or pursuing a trial, or know somebody who is interested or simply want to know more about clinical trials. These are my disclosures. So let's start with, why should I consider a trial? First and foremost, your oncologist or your cancer doctor uses national cancer guidelines. And oftentimes it's the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, which is sort of our scripture, so to speak, that really tells us what is considered the standard of care. And by standard of care, I mean what has the highest level of evidence, which has really been determined through decades of research before. That tells us this is the most tried and true treatment. And oftentimes, what we will see in these cancer guidelines is that patients are to be offered a clinical trial if one is available, and it's considered preferred and or recommended in terms of the recommendation. Similarly, as Dr. Wise-Draper mentioned earlier, you have potential access to an exciting treatment that is actively being tested that you wouldn't be able to access otherwise. Until a drug gets FDA approval, there's really no recourse to be able to get access to that drug sooner if you are not participating in a clinical trial. Sometimes I will get asked, well, can I just pay for it? And the answer is no. And sometimes people will ask, well, can we ask the drug company to provide it? And there is a mechanism which is called compassionate use, or also known as expanded access, in which pharmaceutical companies may offer us the access to that drug. However, those types of requests are very limited in terms of the fact that generally these companies are not going to simply provide drug if it's not already FDA approved, for a variety of reasons. So if it's not approved, it's very hard for you to get access to these more promising treatments without participation. And then in terms of what is already approved and on the market, based on where someone may be in their treatment journey, you may not have any great options left, or your doctor may actually consider the clinical trial to be a more attractive option to consider first. And what I often will tell my patients is that we can always fall back on the already approved treatments. And if there is a trial that I think scientifically sounds very sound and the early data is showing significant promise, it may actually be a better option to start with the trial first and then go back to those already approved treatments down the line if needed. Timing of a trial also matters. Sometimes I will get asked, I don't want to do this trial right now. I'd like to try something that's already approved. But if that doesn't work, can I then go back to this specific trial? And the answer is maybe. Many times, however, it may be no. And the reason for that is because clinical trials have very specific criteria that has been established when the trial was developed. And some of those criteria include how many treatments have individuals already received. Some of these trials require that you have not received any treatment to date. So if you start on a standard of care treatment, then that trial is no longer an option for you thereafter. However, even if a specific trial is no longer an option for you, that doesn't mean that there aren't other trials that could be an option down the road. And then another consideration is that oftentimes with clinical trials, because um, the physicians involved and the companies who are supplying the drug are really paying very close attention to what's happening, because sometimes we don't know what the side effects might be. You will get more surveillance and monitoring within the confounds of a trial that you might not be receiving with already approved treatments that have established safety profiles. So some individuals actually like that they might get more surveillance or monitoring. Conversely, others may not enjoy that because that might mean more time commitment and travel to and from their hospital. And then, as it has already been highlighted in both of the previous talks, this is really about paying it forward. For some individuals, they do find meaning and purpose, as Stephen highlighted, in being able to participate in a trial, because in that sense, they are able to not only hopefully get benefit themselves, but allow others to get benefit as well. And what I often tell my patients when they ask me, how do we know that this is the best treatment? I really emphasize, because of all the individuals who sat in that chair before you over the many years that have passed, who did participate in trials, it was their willingness to do so that has allowed us to figure out what is now the best option to offer. So why might a trial not be offered? You know, the emphasis today is talking about pursuing trials and you know, why you might want to be in a trial, but there are times also where a trial might not be offered. So there may not be a trial that is open at the particular time where you are at in your treatment course. You know, researchers are always trying to find gaps in scientific knowledge and create trials to improve upon what we're already doing. But sometimes there may not be an open trial that is available with where you're at in your journey. Sometimes it's simply a logistical thing where the hospital where you are receiving your treatment doesn't have a trial. And this was one of the questions in the chat that I answered earlier. You know, if your specific hospital does not have a trial available and you have the means to be able to travel, ask your oncologist if there is a trial you should consider going elsewhere. Your oncologist really has your best interests at the forefront. And so it's not one of those where they're going to try to keep you at their hospital because they don't want you to seek an option elsewhere. As long as insurance permits and you have the capability to be able to go elsewhere, if there is a good trial option for you within reason, that might be something to consider. And again, your doctor can be a starting point. Dr. Wise-Draper mentioned the various ways in which you yourself can also look for trials, but that can be very overwhelming at times. And so it's also okay to just ask your doctor and they can help you. There have been times where I've had folks come to my clinic with a very rare tumor, and I've already done the clinicaltrials.gov review to see if there is a trial that they could be eligible somewhere else in the region or in the country, because I don't specifically have a trial for them. The one thing I would point out here is you don't want to spend too much time shopping around. Cancer will not wait. It doesn't work that way. So you can look for trials, but this is not a process that should take several months. And then the clinical trial finder tools, as I mentioned, that you can reference as well. And the other simple matter is you may simply not qualify for a clinical trial at that time. Your doctor may have a trial available and he or she may have already pre-screened you, but every trial, again, has very specific criteria to ensure that the right type of patients are being put on the study. And so it may simply be something such as your cancer or the number of previous treatments that you received or a specific health condition you have may make you ineligible for safety concerns, for an example. And then finally, clinical trials may simply not be on your doctor's radar. This is not to say that your doctor is intentionally not thinking about it or that it's a major oversight, but there are a lot of moving parts when it comes to providing you comprehensive care. And so I simply mention this just so that you feel empowered to ask your doctor, is a trial an option for me? Asking the question in a different way, why might a trial not be right for me? What I would emphasize is you really need to be comfortable with your decision, and you really need to make an informed decision about the treatment that you are going to pursue. And that holds true for whether you are receiving a trial or what's considered already approved treatment. So if there is any aspect of the clinical trial where you are simply not comfortable with it, then a trial might not be right for you. Clinical trials are asking a question, so there is some element of uncertainty that is inherently built into that clinical trial. If we already knew the answer, it would be an existing treatment. So some people just simply don't like the fact that there is an element of uncertainty, or that they don't get to choose which arm of treatment they will receive. So this goes back to that comment earlier about randomization, where that's really determined by chance. It's a computer-based generated decision, and it's done that way to randomly assign people to the different treatment arms. If we knew which arm was better, then it wouldn't be ethical to do so. So some individuals don't like that lack of choice, and then others, do not wish to receive treatments that may have side effects that haven't been determined yet. Now, this is also a very important point. With clinical trials that do involve a randomization, meaning you get assigned to a treatment arm, sometimes people will drop out of the study if they don't like the treatment that they were assigned to. Now, you always have the right to revoke your signature. You always have the right to say, I do not want to be part of this trial. I've changed my mind. That holds true at any time. I just want to highlight here, though, that if you decide you want to be on a study, you really have to commit that no matter what the assignment might be, that you are willing to stay on the study. The reason that matters is it can have a major impact on the statistical analysis, the data integrity, and ultimately it could affect the outcome of the trial. And then if you are unable to commit to either increased time or travel, and life still goes on even with a cancer diagnosis, sometimes this is just a practicality that people cannot overcome. Clinical trials oftentimes do have more clinic visits. You might have to get your blood drawn more often. Your infusion appointments, for example, if it's intravenous based therapy, those appointments might be longer. You might be asked to do biopsies. So there are, other factors where even if you're interested, practically speaking, it might not work out for you with your life. And I wanted to mention here that some studies do reimburse for travel. So you can ask if there is any reimbursement if you need to, if you are going to be on a trial, because gas prices are only getting higher. And so it's one of those where this is something that might help to offset. And then going back to what I mentioned earlier, you need to make an informed decision. So gather as much information as you need. When your doctor presents you the clinical trial, you do not have to make a decision Johnny on the spot. You can be provided a consent to take home and to review, to digest what you're reading, come up with additional questions that you might have that you can then ask your doctor. Sometimes I will get the feedback from my patient that they just want me to make the decision for them. And really, that's not what we are there to do. We can help guide you and support you. But we really, when it comes to trials, because they are voluntary, this is not a decision that we can make on your behalf. And if at the end of the day, you've taken the time to review the trial and you've asked the questions that you wanted to ask and you're still just not sure, then my recommendation is you probably shouldn't participate in a trial at that time and just opt for the treatments that are already approved. Am I a good candidate for a trial? So the doctor has now identified a trial, or you've identified a trial, and this is really questions that are going to be focused on, do I qualify? Am I the right candidate? Oftentimes I'll get asked about age. Clinical trials may or may not specify an age. Usually, for example, many of the trials I work with are all for adults, so they don't involve children. But there oftentimes is not an age requirement other than being an adult. And do not be fearful if you are of advanced age. There is data that shows that people of advanced age may not be offered trials as often as their counterparts who might be much younger. And sometimes that is also just fear or comfort level of the physician being concerned that somebody might not be able to withstand the therapies. But your age is not necessarily an exclusion. And what we look at as physicians is not your chronologic age, but your functional age. And that makes a big difference. A 90-year-old gentleman who has no other medical problems and is walking 2 to 3 miles a day is a very different candidate than somebody who is 90 and comes in a wheelchair or is confined to the bed and has, serious medical problems that might make it unsafe. How do your other health conditions get factored in? Well, when you meet with your doctor and they do their comprehensive assessment, part of that assessment is understanding what are your other health problems. So oftentimes you might be getting asked questions about your high blood pressure or your diabetes, and you're wondering, why does the doctor care about my diabetes when I'm here for my cancer diagnosis? But there is a method to that madness. And that is really for us to assess from a safety perspective if this trial is right for you and that your other health conditions might not get in the way of that. And we also look at your medications. Some clinical trials prohibit certain medications from being included. And again, oftentimes this stems from safety concerns. So we will review your medication list to see if there are any that might be problematic that we can either stop or switch you to something else. And then oftentimes people do wish to take supplements as well. If you are planning to take supplements and you're considering a clinical trial, please let your doctor know what those supplements are so we can review to determine if it's okay for you to take. A lot of my patients do not have English as their first or even second language. That's okay. That is not a barrier. Clinical trial consents are translated into other languages when the need arises. And if the language is not already available in a translation, then we will have an interpreter present using an English consent. And then when your consent is available in your native language, we will still have an interpreter present to help consent you. And then one of the biggest questions I often get asked is, am I going to have to pay for this? What will my insurance cover? What is being covered by the study is really what that boils down to. And so what I would emphasize there is when a clinical trial is being initiated at a hospital, there are a lot of steps involved to get that clinical trial opened. One of those steps involves what's called a coverage analysis, and that's basically deciding what of the study procedures would routinely be done anyway, such as a doctor's visit or a scan. Those will then get billed to your insurance. And what study related procedures are not considered standard of care? And those oftentimes will be covered by the pharmaceutical company. So there is an established analysis that has already been developed to determine who covers what, whether it goes to insurance or it goes to the clinical trial. But you can also ask to speak to a financial counselor. Most institutions have one, or somebody related to clinical trial billing that could help answer your questions. And then this comes up a lot. Am I going to disappoint my doctor or upset my doctor if I say no? And the answer is absolutely not. We are there to support you no matter what your decision is. And we are not going to treat you any less differently or view you any differently if you decide the trial is not right for you. So in no way, shape, or form should you feel pressured to participate. This is really meant to be something that is truly voluntary, and that you feel comfortable pursuing. Okay, so you're interested in the trial's been offered. Now what happens? The next question I usually get is, how soon can I start? Well, there are some steps involved. The first thing is you sign the consent. That simply allows us to get the ball rolling to determine if you formally qualify. So signing a consent does not automatically mean that you do qualify, and it does not automatically mean that you will receive the treatment. The other point here is you can change your mind at any time. You sign that consent and have buyer's remorse 5 minutes later, 3 days later, you just let us know, and we will honor your decision. After you sign the consent, there is then what's called a screening period. And there are procedures that are done. Now, that may be another visit with your doctor. That may be some additional blood tests. It may include additional scans. You may have recently had scans that determined something changed with the status of your cancer. And so those scans may be utilized, but they might not be. Because, for example, a trial might want an MRI, but you had a CT. Or your CT was done 4 weeks ago and the trial needs those scans to be done within a shorter window. So sometimes we try not to duplicate things if we can avoid it and use what's already been done when we can, but sometimes you might need to have additional blood tests or repeat your scans, even though you felt you just had one recently. And some trials require biopsies as well. Once all of those screening tests are completed and we have all those results, then again, your doctor will review with the clinical team, the research team, but your doctor will review the eligibility criteria to make sure that you meet all of the criteria specified by the study. There's no wiggle room there. We do not get to negotiate, unfortunately. So if a lab value is out of range and there's no way for us to reverse that, that might be a reason that you simply just unfortunately don't qualify. So your doctor will do this review. The sponsor for the study will do this review as well. And then you get the green light one way or another. And then once it's been confirmed that you qualify, then your treatments will be scheduled. These clinical trials have specified windows in which you need to start. So it's not like you sign a consent, to determine you qualify, and then you say, I want to wait 2-3 months to start treatment. Unfortunately, it won't work that way. You need to start treatment within a reasonable time frame. And most of the time, people are really asking, how soon can I start? Not how long can I delay this? So what are some things to be aware of when you're on a clinical trial? Do your labs, your blood work, your scans, your treatment all have to be done at the same location? It depends. For some trials, yes, it has to occur at the same place. Sometimes there is wiggle room there, so you can talk to your doctor and the clinical research team. What if you have a major side effect? Well, if you do, obviously with any treatment, if you have a side effect, talk to your doctor. First and foremost, They want to make sure that you are receiving these treatments as safely as possible, and they will help to address whatever the acute issue is. And then they will determine if it makes sense for you to stay on the trial or not. The goal here is not to keep you on a trial if it's unsafe to do so. What happens if you're on the trial and a better treatment comes around? Well, if that was the case, if there was a new FDA approval and we knew that something might actually be better, then it would be unethical to keep you on the trial. And your doctor would pivot if that was the case. And then I get asked this a lot. So the study might say that the treatment continues for 2 years. Well, what happens after that? If you are still on treatment after 2 years and you're doing well and it's benefiting you, many times the pharmaceutical companies will permit you to stay on treatment, even beyond 2 years. And that's a discussion that happens between your doctor and the company. So there are options for you sometimes to even stay on therapy beyond 2 years. And a couple more questions is, what if the treatment on the trial doesn't help? Do you have other options? The answer is possibly. This is where, again, talk to your doctor. Your blood samples and biopsies that are obtained for the trial, there's a lot of scientific research that is already kind of preset in the protocol for the study that is going to be performed on those samples and on those biopsies. And oftentimes, those samples and biopsies are all aggregated, and then the testing may be done simultaneously. So we won't get results right away. And as you heard Stephen mentioning earlier, his oncologist couldn't really tell him results of the trial. And it's not that we're withholding that information, but really we don't have the results yet. Some of these trials, the results may not be known for possibly years. So those are some considerations as well. Now, when the results are available, they can be shared with you. And so that's where I will conclude. With the common facts of today are the products of yesterday's research. And I just want to thank all of you for being part of this and being willing to consider clinical trials, because it's your participation that allows us as doctors to better care for those individuals who sit in that clinic exam room, today, tomorrow, and in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sacco, for providing answers to some of the most frequently asked questions and some of the questions that we may not even have thought to ask. So thank you. So just a quick reminder, we are providing you with some slide resources for all our attendees today. And this entire presentation will be available on the Head and Neck Cancer Alliance website, along with the recorded webinar. So I know it's 8 o'clock, but I do want to open up for a few questions that our panelists can answer for you. So we do have a few unanswered questions. So here's one for Dr. Sacco and Wise-Draper. Are all or most clinical trials funded by pharmaceutical companies? Are there non-pharmaceutical clinical trials?
I can go ahead and take the first stab at it. So no, not all trials are funded by pharmaceutical companies. So some can be funded by government grants, so National Cancer Institute, NIH. Some are funded through cooperative mechanisms, which are still going to be mostly government supported. Sometimes they can have industry support as well. Philanthropy can sometimes help fund a trial, especially investigator-initiated trials where maybe they're developed within the university. Those are commonly supported by maybe academic funds that you may have, but no, they're not always funded by pharmaceutical companies, though they can't, a lot of them are.
And I'll just add to that, there are, as Dr. Wise-Draper highlighted, multiple funding resources. Do not be alarmed or scared if you see that the trial is being funded by a pharmaceutical company. The reality is many times the study was actually written or designed by the doctor, him or herself. And We don't have the drug, we don't have the funds. We have to go to the company to seek the drug and seek the funds. So it's really a partnership, but your doctor may actually have been the expert who designed the study. If for some reason the study was designed by the pharmaceutical company, please know that it's not just some nebulous group of people that have no scientific background and have never spoken to a doctor. They oftentimes will partner and have advisory boards and physicians who are directly involved in the clinical trial to make sure that it makes sense. And then also, as Dr. Wise-Draper mentioned earlier, we are not going to open trials if we don't think that they make scientific sense and that there's reasonable chances of benefit for you. So yes, there are various funding sources, but please do not be deterred by it being from a pharmaceutical company, because some people are.
Thank you. Another question is, what if a patient gets sick from experimental treatment? Does the trial cover the recovery? How can you tell if the side effects are from the experimental treatment versus cancer?
So in terms of side effects, with clinical trials, it's a very rigorous process. And for my patients, they'll actually see me document this in my clinic notes. But we have, whenever there's a possible side effect, we describe that as what's called an adverse event. And then we have grading criteria that allows us to say, well, how severe is it? Is it mild, or is it much more serious and potentially life-threatening? We then try in our best knowledge to determine attribution. And so that really stems from, previous preclinical data. So trials prior to, human involvement, or even early phase trials where we're learning purely about safety. So we have some reasonable knowledge about side effects that the drug may cause. And then sometimes we don't know. So we will attribute a relatedness. Regardless of whether the side effect is caused by the drug or not, as physicians, we will treat you to make sure that we get that side effect hopefully to resolution. Oftentimes, insurance is billed. There may be some component that, again, is addressed by the trial itself. But that's a great question. I don't know, Trisha, if you have something additional you'd like to add.
No, I agree with everything you said, Dr. Sacco. So I think, really, it's dependent on the trial on how much they're going to cover. And it is part of the consent normally when we go through it. Most of the time, if it's directly related to the drug, then normally it's covered. But it really depends by the funding source too. So there could be different scenarios depending on what happens.
One final question for you two is, given the recent government downsizing and the political climate, how do you think this will impact clinical trials in head and neck cancer?
It's a tough one. I answered a little bit through the answers, and that I think we're all somewhat worried about funding for research in general, and that unfortunately does affect clinical trials as well, especially those that I just mentioned were government supported or government funded, even if it's an adjunct. We just have to continue to advocate for support for clinical research. Again, it's the only way that we're going to be able to get new drugs approved for patients. And in addition, more importantly to me is the discovery science. So clinical trials come from the research that happens actually in a laboratory. So if you're doing any kind of research in the laboratory and that uncovers a possible new target or a mechanism or a drug, that comes from academic centers most of the time in a lab. So if we don't have the funding to do that, then we will not even get to clinical trials. So it goes farther than just clinical trials themselves. So yes, we're all concerned, and I think it's important that we all advocate to say cancer matters and that we've made all this progress in the last 30 years. I mean, some really great breakthroughs. How can we continue to help the government understand how important it is to fund cancer research, and that privatizing is not going to work if you lose your discovery science.
We do have one last question, if you have one more minute. Regarding clinical trials, how broad can the inclusion criteria be for a given study, given the various types of cancer that are cramped in the head and neck anatomy? Does being treatment naive matter?
Yeah, so the criteria are determined by the either the physician who's designing the study or the pharmaceutical company, for example. So those criteria can be either intentionally very broad or they may intentionally be restrictive. So for example, for head and neck cancer trials, they can specify which parts of the mouth and throat may qualify and what parts of the head and neck may disqualify. So, for example, if your cancer is in the sinuses or up behind the nose, that might be an exclusion. So the answer is some trials really are intended to be very broad, particularly phase 1 trials. But when other trials are intentionally going to be more restrictive, and they may specify no prior lines of treatment, only one prior line, no more than 2 prior lines, or it may be something as broad as has exhausted standard of care therapies. So it really simply depends on the clinical trial with respect to that.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it for us. So again, I would like to thank Doctors Wise-Draper and Sacco, as well as Ambassador Steve, for serving on the panel and providing your insights, knowledge, and lived experience. So a special thanks to the Head and Neck Cancer Alliance and American Head and Neck Society for their time in organizing and hosting this webinar, Putting Patients First, Navigating Clinical Trials for Head and Neck Cancer. So we'll provide information for the webinar survey. So thank you for taking the time to let us know how we did. So thank you everyone for joining us and have a great rest of the evening. Take care.